So, hello, Lisa Dinhofer. Nice to
Hello,
see you.
Robert. Nice to see you as well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this interview because you do something really unique, really special, not something everyone else does, and have deep knowledge in it. So, we're going to get into that. So, tell us how you are an ordinary visionary.
Well, I suppose my version of that is believing that the expertise around grief and loss from both death and non death losses and trauma has a place in everyday workplaces and that it's desperately needed. And, when I was in grad school, I'm a thanatologist by background. That's people who study death and grief and loss. And I have a subspecialty in trauma. A lot of my, classmates went into the very typical industries of, mortuary or hospice or healthcare or social work, things like that. And I am a trained counselor, but I believed very early on that this work was necessary and needed in our workplaces because there's so much suffering going on in organizations that for the most part is really unnecessary, but it's there and it's gotten a lot worse. And I think what really solidified this for me was back in February of 1993 when I was working in the World Trade Center that was bombed the first time with the car bomb in the car park underneath.
Oh, wow.
And I still was working in New York City, September 11th. But what I saw how the leadership of the organization I worked in, how they were handling this, it was a masterclass in what not to do. And I saw the wounding that caused on top of, what already happened. And it made a huge impact on me. Huge.
So, clients that you work with, ideally, are experiencing some kind of trauma, have experienced a trauma, a death, a suicide, a killing, some unimaginable thing, and they need to figure out what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? How are we going to communicate with our people? That kind of thing. So tell me more about that, what your work looks like and the kind of situations where you're brought in.
Yeah. My work is really varied. Yes, I get brought in for what I call the shock trauma events, active shooting, some fatality, suicide in the workplace, which sadly has gone way up,
Hmm.
scandal, uh, massive layoffs, which is extremely traumatizing for not only people who've lost their job, but the people who are left behind who still have their job. And then there's those people who are experiencing a lot of trauma and secondary impact from the actual work that they do, because their work involves, very vulnerable population, high risk population. Maybe they're first responders, healthcare, teachers. They see a lot, they hear a lot. And then
Sure.
there's the third category of trauma that's in the workplace that is the primary driver of trauma in most workplaces. And that is from the environment itself, the relational environment itself. Bullying, harassment, people who have trauma in their background and bring it to the table. Trauma repeats, right? So it gets projected out into the workplace and it creates a lot of conflict, a lot of scratchiness, a lot of relational issues. And I have not yet met a leader who does not have trauma in their background and who is not
You've
aware.
never met a leader that doesn't have trauma in their background? Is that kind
Correct.
of a badge of courage that I've had trauma, I can be a leader?
Absolutely not. And I'm really glad you said that because um, it it impacts leaders in ways that they really don't understand. It impacts how they communicate, how they relate to people, how they connect or not, how they go about making decisions. And this is all unconscious influence. And it creates a lot of toxic environments. It creates a lot of people quitting and retention problems and relational issues. But most importantly, it's a huge obstruction to innovation and creativity because human beings cannot be in survival mode. And if you're working with somebody who's projecting this out, you're in protective survival mode, right? Our human brains are not hardwired to be in survival mode.
Yeah.
And have the frontal lobe here, the executive portion of the brain, lit up at the same time. So this and back here, the limbic system, they cannot light up at the same time. And survival mode always wins. So you work it against yourself when your environment is marinated in this.
So when we have big goals in a company or something happens and you're trying to create a very I don't know, very complex product or service or something like that, and it's not working and people are leaving. I mean, companies are big, complex organisms,
Yes, they are.
all consisting of people,
That's
many
right.
of which don't handle emergencies too well, and they can't be calm, cool, and collected, right? And they start yelling at people, and they start, I've never worked in a big company. The very small company I did work in was also like that. It was
Yep.
toxic.
Yep.
I think after that, I decided I don't want to work in a company
Right.
anymore.
Which is exactly why I stopped working for people too. I couldn't tolerate the toxic and the abuse anymore. I said, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah. So tell us more about the sort of the origin of this with the average person and how it manifests. And I think it's interesting because it seems to me that there's so much of this that we sort of think of it as normal.
That's right.
It's like, well, things are crazy, so you got to work 24 hours. We got to get this out of here. It's like we create emergencies. I've created that kind of stuff myself to some degree. It's sort of like, and I go, whoa, I'm just making this up,
Well, it's survival mode. You're coming from a place that's driven by fear. And as I've said to so many of my coaching clients over the year, fear is not a fact. It's just a feeling. But human beings, when they're in an environment that is being constructed by fear, we go into survival mode. That's how we're hardwired to survive. But the basic premise from which I do my work, when it's this kind of issue, not, somebody came in with an AK-47 kind of issue. But my basic premise is it is not necessary for organizations to break people to be successful. You don't have to break people. And it's this model of leadership, this command and control, obedience-driven, authoritarian-style leadership that's been around for, many, 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 many years that people just keep emulating, the generations keep emulating, that is so counterproductive to what companies really want to do, and that is to make things and create progress and all that stuff. But you cannot scare people into being productive. But you cannot expect people to override their biology. So it's helping people understand and recognize trauma responses in themselves as well as other people. So if I said to you, Robert, what do you think trauma looks like in people? What does that look like? How do you know if someone, is coming from a place of trauma? What would you say?
Let's see. Well, I suppose it could look like almost anything, but I think of I'm thinking of this because I'm watching Star Trek a lot these days, and Star Trek is a model of society that is very professional, cool, calm, and collected, and they do things that are, they chase space aliens for God's sake, and all this stuff.
Right.
But it's, relationship is very important. You don't hear people yelling at each other. It's, so that's what's not like that. But franticness, anger, shortness, impatience, working ridiculous hours, a situation or environment that feels stressful. That's what I would think.
Yeah. And we do
Yeah.
sense that, right? We are hardwired as animals to sense that stress because the brain registers that as a threat, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times people will say, well, trauma looks like somebody really upset. They're really emotive, maybe crying, maybe, but trauma also speaks through other masks and costumes, if you will. People coming from a place of trauma, particularly in leadership, can be very remote, hold people at an arm's length, very emotionally shut down, emotionally unavailable, have a very hair trigger temper. They're abrasive. They can be mean, off-putting. It creates a lot of conflict and scratchiness. Those are some indicators of trauma as well. And when I am working with leaders in particular, even when it's because of a shock trauma event, right? I always start with self-awareness, because without that, a leader is really trying to lead with two hands behind their back. They don't really understand the influence that they're putting out there. And the safest thing to do in an organization is to emulate your boss, right? So,
And
right?
if he's nuts, you are too.
Yeah, and that's how people get promoted, right? So it doesn't help the organization at all. It doesn't help your retention rates at all. But going back to what you said, this kind of behavior in the workplace has been characterized as normal. It's been romanticized. It's also been seen as something you want to strive for. And it's ineffective. And we've known for decades and decades it's ineffective. But it was tolerated. What the pandemic did, and this is a very common occurrence after people go through a crisis, your priorities get reorganized. There is a reflection on values. And since the pandemic, people are simply not willing to tolerate it anymore. And they're saying no, and they're speaking up, and they're speaking back. And particularly because our organizations are more and more populated with a younger generation, younger than baby boomer, they have no hesitation of speaking up and saying, yep, not for me. And they're out the door.
Yeah. Well, also during the pandemic, a lot of people went virtual. I've been virtual for
Right.
25 years. And often in your own space, you're not being bombarded in the same kind of way. And you can be a little calmer and just work on your own. And people have discovered the joys of working on your own. Not that that's the whole solution, but it also seems to me that the average office or work environment is not a sort of a natural thing.
It's not.
We grew up in a family with 2 or 3 or 4 siblings, and all of a sudden you have people from mixed backgrounds, and who knows what they were, and who knows how much anger and trauma there were in those families. So we have all these people around, none of who we really know that well to begin with.
Right.
And, and all of a sudden, you get a boss that's really demanding and is an asshole. And
that's your word, not mine, but okay. I'll accept it.
Well, that's a technical word.
But even those who are not, even those with leadership styles of avoidance and people pleasing, those leadership styles are just as destructive. And I have yet to sit down and talk with people who come from that place, that is not an intelligence that was formed in a previous part of their life because of trauma. And that intelligence at that time, and when I say intelligence, I don't mean IQ. I mean the brain and your body brought forward that behavior to sustain you and get you through this trauma. So it was intelligence back then, but it is not necessary now. But it has become very acculturated in how you navigate the world. And when we walk into workplaces, there's this expectation that we take off our humanity, that we stop being human beings. We stop being emotional human beings. I don't mean emotional where we're on the floor crying, sucking our thumb. I mean that we're not full spectrum human beings, that we are just these units of output of productivity.
Yeah.
And we're not. And the world is changing at a very fast clip, and human beings and organizations are struggling to adapt at the same degree. And what I find that happens in organizations, two things. There's a hardening and an overriding. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. You know, after the bombing in 93, we were kept out of the building for 3 weeks because the building had to be completely clean. So we got shipped off to another location, and then we came back in to this location. Now, my office was on the 79th floor. So you had to take a bank of elevators up to the 79th floor. And if you wanted to go to Windows on the World, you had to get off my floor, walk across, and go up higher. So the first day back, a lot of my colleagues were stuck in the lobby. They couldn't get in the elevator. They're having panic attacks because what they endured getting out of that building was horrific. And if you remember the photo shots of that day, everyone came out with soot coming out of their nose. And how people got out is through the fire stairwells, but those doors didn't work. So they were completely engulfed in thick black smoke. You couldn't even see a hand in front of you. So people had to go down 79 flights or higher, kind of on their butt, step by step. Otherwise you'd get trampled completely without being able to see. And it took hours and hours when you were high up, right? So this was very traumatizing. Yeah. So the first day they're in the lobby and they're having panic attacks. They can't get in the elevator, and they're there all day. And the second day this happened, now leadership is getting angry and they're threatening people that they're going to dock their pay.
Oh, that's nice.
Well, that didn't work. And then the third day and more, now we're going to threaten you with your job. You don't get in that elevator and we're going to fire you. So people were literally having others pull them on to the elevator and hold on to them. And they would stumble out of the elevator on the 79th floor with all the physiological, biological responses of acute stress response. And now they're supposed to sit down and do their job.
I bet a lot of people quit because of that. I'm sure.
Yes. Within months, the front door became a turnstile. There was a stampede out the front door. But what made this worse was that leadership said to us, the first days we were back, we are not going to talk about this.
Okay.
We don't want you talking.
Suppress it, right?
We don't want you talking with each other about this. You are to just get back to work and get busy.
Oh, man.
Right? So there's an example of the hardening and the overriding, right? Just hardening to what is right in front of them rather than responding skillfully, hardening to what's right in front of them and insisting that overriding. We don't deal with that here and we need to get back to work. And that response is still very much alive and well in organizations, not because people are bad. They just don't know what to do. But for me, the biggest sin for my leadership and the reason why I left that organization is because there was an unwillingness for those in leadership to recognize this was beyond their skill set and a refusal to get the help they needed to deal with this. Right. So they just went into that command and control. And P.S., that company went bankrupt. And I'm convinced that their morale was already bad because of the command and control leadership style. But the way that was handled, and when that stampede out the front door, I knew it was just a matter of time. And they did go bankrupt.
I wouldn't be surprised if there were a company or two in the World Trade Center at that time that handled it better.
Yeah, it gets down to the leader. The leader and the leadership team is what sets the tone for the organization. And people take their cues from those who have more power than they do. So if it's this obedience driven, just get back to work, you better start producing, you're not going to get good outcomes. You will not. It's those leaders that I see that step into the container. I call it the being container. There's 3 containers. When I'm working with leaders, I tell them there's the being container, literally, who are you showing up as? Right? The second is the connecting container. How well do you connect with your people, and how well do you help them connect with each other? And the third container is the efforting, the doing. In the pandemic, we saw a lot of people in leadership positions, whether they were managers or supervisors or directors or senior executives. They went heavy into the doing. They thought we're going to produce our way out of this. And it was not effective. And the more it wasn't effective, the more they panicked. It was those leaders that came forward, and it was through their relational skills. Their people stayed on board, and
Empathy.
and relational skills. And those are not soft skills. Those are basic human being skills. That is really a major determinant of whether people want to work for you or not. It's not so much what the company does. Yes, it's important, but who are you? Who am I going to be dealing with every day? Yeah. Right? And it's that bucket, the relational skills, that people in leadership receive the least amount of training. Right? And so when you have something like, I just dealt with an organization that had a fatal stabbing and a fatal shooting all in one event. Right. And, you know, the leadership of this organization really did a good job in terms of what they understood they needed help in, and they paid attention to recommendations and suggestions, and they followed that expertise. And you could see how their people, even on that day, were gravitating to them and felt deep reassurance by this leader, the way he was showing up. They trusted him. They were not going to bail and walk out the door. And you could see that just his presence, this is what I mean by relational skills, helped their central nervous systems come down. And this relational skill is called attunement. And when leaders understand how to do this, it has a huge impact in their people and in their environment.
So how would you, now this person maybe already had that skill. Maybe he trained in it, I don't know. Some people are like the captain of the Starship Enterprise. They inspire, they're calm. Mm-hmm. When he gives an order, you know it makes sense, you know, all of that. That whole culture. So how for people in a company or leaders in a company that are realizing maybe their style of leadership is only making things worse, mm-hmm. What is the work they need to do, and what's the help they need to get that can make a shift? I mean, it sounds simple, but if you put me on the Starship Enterprise, I don't know, we'd crash into a nebula in 5 minutes. Anyway, so it's not necessarily a simple. It seems simple in some way, cool, calm, collected, and present, and encouraging and empathetic, but that's not a small thing.
So this fellow that I'm thinking about, he heads a very, very large organization. And it's not that he had any experience dealing with something like this, or he even knew where to begin. But he was smart enough to ask for help, which is why I was there that day. I did a debriefing for leadership and a debriefing for employees. And what I said to him is, I asked him, I want you to ask yourself right now, who are you showing up as? I want you to really think about that. And be transparent. Be humble. Tell them the story you just told me. Talk to them. And you don't have to figure out what are the next steps necessarily all by yourself. Tap into the gold in the collective. And he said, well, how do I do that? I said, ask them. He said, what do you mean? I said, right now. Ask them these questions. What do you need to feel safe to walk back into the building? What do you need to feel safe to walk into those particular rooms in the building where this transpired. What do you need to feel safe to remain employed here, to stay? Just the act of asking, it really engaged them, and it communicated, I'm listening to you. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers, because I said to him, they already know you don't have all the answers, so don't waste your time and energy pretending that you do, like you're the guy in the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. They already know you don't have those answers. What they need to know is that they can trust you to get the help you need, and that the decisions you make will be in their best benefit, not at their sacrifice. So ask them and understand this is going to be a process, right? And I took him through, I have some processes that I've created over the years about strategizing for the year ahead and after that, because it takes a lot longer to unpack this than most people think. And also, so what are those strategies? What's the process? And also, it is imperative that you begin to identify the impact. And those impacts, again, this is a process I've come up with, is it identified in concentric circles. So I helped him understand that as well. But you could see him completely relax when he began asking, and they were all raising their hands and talking with him, right? We're a team now. So it's not he has to suddenly be something he's not. He just has to show up as someone who is going to listen, who recognizes. And he said, I recognize you guys don't know what to do with this. And guess what? I don't either. And that's why I've brought her in to help us. So that humility is imperative.
When you have an incident like that, a violence, someone gets killed, someone commits suicide, whatever, any of those things are traumatic, then it brings that issue to the fore, and you go, wow, we really have a problem here, and they are lucky enough to find someone like you that can help them through it. But it seems that, in day-to-day business, it can be like running around with your hair on fire and everybody's stressed all the time. And yet it's so much in the culture that, there's no problem here.
Right. So
but anyone with any sensitivity could pick it up in about a second, right?
So I asked him a series of questions. I ask a lot of why questions. Why do you communicate in that way? Why do you embrace this leadership style? Where did that come from? Can you trace back for me where you began thinking like this, or why and how, and help me understand? And how far back does this go for you? And most people are so cut off from self-awareness, they can't make the connections. But when they're willing to do that work and they make the connections, I see them have these aha moments that it's just this silence where they're sitting there looking at me and you can see the light bulb go on. And that's when the work really begins of change and transformational change. And once they understand why they do that, they already know it's not working. They know. They can see it in people. They just don't know what to do with that. Once they understand the why, then you can embrace the how, right? And there are, people like me out there who help people make these transformational changes, not just within themselves, but in the organization. And one of my preferred methods of doing this, especially when there's been a lot of trauma, whether it's from a major event you can pinpoint, or you just have a lot of people that are toxic in an organization that's created this legacy, especially after bullying and harassment and things like that. I like to embrace and use appreciative inquiry. It is a very positive approach process from moving from where you were with having very unwanted outcomes to not only where you want to be, but where you could be, and you haven't even necessarily thought of that. And I find that process particularly helpful when there's been a marination of trauma, and toxicity in an organization, because people get to a point where they believe that they'll never change. This can't change. It's just impossible. And that's not true.
There's something that many people have told me over the years and I've read about is that people don't leave a company, they leave a boss.
That's right. That's right.
It's like dealing with this person is no fun. It's making me stressed. I'm not happy. I'm not getting where I want. So, if you could make a wild guess, what percentage of bosses are really not very good bosses that way?
Do you want my honest opinion?
Yeah,
Probably mid 90s.
mid 90%.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting because we're not really brought up to learn how to be a leader or a boss. We don't
No.
have, sometimes maybe you're the head of the football team and maybe and you have a great coach and and you see people that really grow out of that and they become great business leaders because of that. And we see that in, I can't remember the names. Sports coaches have written books about that leadership, and which
you notice it's coaching. It's not bossing people around. It's coaching for people to be better at what they do.
Right.
And
right.
I just had a conversation with the president of a board of a nonprofit that is in a 5-alarm fire situation because half of the midline management staff has walked out, and then a person from the senior leadership team walked out. And the responses from an employee assessment and the exit interviews, there's a clear trajectory, a clear line, and it is the leadership style and behavior of the CEO. And so I had an opportunity to sit down with the CEO, and I said to this person, your people are talking to you with their feet. At what point are you going to listen? I give you a year and a half, maybe, with your doors open if things don't really change. And tears came into this person's eyes. It's not that they didn't know. This person just didn't know what to do and was scared to death. And I have a great deal of empathy for that. I really do. And we're not born knowing how to be leaders, right? You have to learn. But look at what our examples are. It's very Western culture, very male-dominated kind of toughness and hyper-individualism and hyper-productivity. And if you're not overworking, you're lazy. And it's just been a bad role model.
Yeah. And you see that in the presidency. If you have a president that's compassionate and listening and stuff like that, he's attacked for not being strong and a hard ass,
Right. Which women get attacked for in politics because they're not going to be strong enough. And here's the thing. When I hear that kind of language, I ask people, well, start defining that for me and tell me what that means to you and how do you view your employees? How do you look at them? What are they to you? And then I will reflect that back and say, well, so what is it like being on the receiving end of you? Because here's the thing. You don't manage people in a workplace. You manage their experience of working for you. How would you like working for you? You like it here because you're in charge. But if you weren't in charge, would you like it? And again,
right.
It's not because they're bad people. There's something going on there that informs them, this is how I have to be in order to be seen to play the role of being a good leader. And the role model for a good leader really needs revamping. But why they feel that way, why they feel they need to play a role, rather than, again, that question, who are you showing up as? And is it effective? Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And so often it's tied to previous experiences of loss and trauma that they just don't see the connection. Because until now, loss and trauma have not been considered appropriate topics in the workplace. And COVID just wiped that out. That's different now. It's a core competency. Being a trauma-informed leader is a core competency now.
So there's a saying for every every bad thing, every disaster, there's often a corresponding good thing that can come out of it.
Yeah, I've seen that out over and over. So
obviously the pandemic was horrific. Something like 1 million people died in the United States.
1.5 million.
1.5 million.
Yep.
And it upset the economy and the workforce and how people worked and people working by themselves and all of that stuff. But that created, people had to be more aware, and it was a wake-up call, you might say.
Yes.
Although never underestimate the possibility of people making the same mistake over and over again. I mean, it's we humans are caught in patterns.
Yes.
Patterns of whatever,
because
good, bad, or
brain
indifferent.
Responds to repetition. That's how we're hardwired.
Right.
The brain doesn't like to create new pathways. It likes to stay with what was, which is why creating new habits is really challenging.
You're familiar with the company called Glassdoor, right?
Yes.
And you can report what it's like to be like working with that company, and which I think is an interesting thing. It gives some transparency. It's like, this is a hellhole. Don't come and work here. Okay, well, maybe that will give them some insight into what they need to do differently, more transparency.
Not necessarily insight. Insight only if they choose to interpret it in that way. Many times we negate and minimize things that we don't like to hear. So it will immediately be attributed to, oh, well, those are people that got fired or left. They're disgruntled. Well, just because someone got fired or left doesn't mean that they don't have valuable information to share with you. It's our willingness to listen, our willingness to take it in. We're not taught how to do that either. So the information is available. In fact, they don't even have to go to Glassdoor. They can ask their people. They can go to their people and ask. And if people are not willing to openly share, immediately that means there is not psychological safety. And without psychological safety, not a whole lot of good can get done in organizations. So you create a very highly anonymous, highly confidential assessment, and you ask the hard questions. Too many times I go into organizations who tell me about these fabulous assessments. I look at the questions and they're all softball questions. When I do the assessment, the responses that come back are not in alignment with that. So you have to be willing to ask the right questions, and you have to be willing to take in what you're told. I've been in leadership meetings where these assessment responses come back and they say, well, we need to do this assessment again and ask the question in a different way because they don't like what they were told. And it's about being willing to listen, not from a place of blame, because that doesn't help you. It's from a place of curiosity and trying to understand, well, why? And so now what do we do with this information? Right? How do we create the kind of change that we need in order to fulfill the company's mission and have good retention rates? So your people will tell you if you're willing to ask and if you're willing to listen. The worst thing a company can do is ask, get the information, and then ignore it. It's better you never ask, because if they tell you and you do nothing, that sends a very loud and clear message.
That's even worse, right?
Yeah.
I think of all these corporations getting bigger and bigger, less personalized, leaders at the top that make 300 times more than their line workers. Mm-hmm. It's a common thing. And, you sometimes feel the only purpose for their life is just to be very, very, very rich. And I wonder if in that kind of large corporate sphere, it's even possible to have a compassionate, caring workforce. I mean, they've got good systems, they create a good product, but it feels like I'm a wage slave
Mm-hmm.
going to work every day. Maybe I'm paid okay, but man, I
Mm-hmm.
don't love it.
And this is
And
where I am, to use your phrase, an ordinary visionary, because not only do I believe absolutely with every fiber of my body it is possible to have large organizations that don't feel like concentration camps when you walk in the morning, but it is an imperative. I'm a member, my company is a member of the conscious capitalism community, and conscious capitalism is all about harnessing business for doing good in the world. And how I manifest that is I don't believe anybody has to walk around wounded. And I look to heal organizations from what has happened to them so that they can truly be what they want to be. Right. And I think it goes to your question is really changing how we go about hiring people who we're looking for to hire and walking the talk with values. This is a place where a lot of information there when people's behavior in leadership positions, and leadership could be a supervisor, a manager, a director, senior leader. There has to be consistency of behavior there. And there has to be expectations of behavior, not just expectations of work output, expectations of behavior, of how we treat each other. And that company, Kodiak Cakes, they make that pancake mix. They've got a great culture. And the CEO, I've listened to interviews with him, and he is a maniac about how people treat each other here. And they have a no a-hole rule. And if you are seen behaving like an a-hole, you will get called out regardless of what rank you're in. And they're a very successful company. I think it's a matter of being willing to change how we do business and how we lead. And it might be generational where, you know, previous generations have to be out and the newer, younger people come in. But they'll just emulate what they see if they don't get the new skill sets. And I go back to what I said at the top of our conversation. It's not necessary for organizations to break people to be successful. And my definition of a leader is someone who creates the conditions and the circumstances for other people's success. It's not just how much money or how much status or how much power can I, bring in. How can I help the people who are willing to share their time and their talent on behalf of this company? How can I help them be successful? Because when they're successful, I will be successful by default.
Right.
It's a mindset.
What do you think of leaders like Elon Musk? A few comments. The guy is obviously a genius. He could start a company on a sideline and make 10 times more than I've made in my life in 2 days. I mean, the guy is a genius. He does all these things, and I appreciate that. And yet he seems to be getting more unhinged and more, I don't know, he just laid off thousands of people, just like that.
So is that a successful leader, and is that a successful company? See, you live in America, we're all part of this culture that we define success by the amount of money a company brings in.
Right.
I don't define success solely by that. I define success by, do people want to work here? Do they like coming to work here? Can they stand being in the room with you more than 5 minutes? There are different measures of success. And yes, he's a visionary in that he can see things that other people couldn't even imagine, like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was not a nice guy to work for. He was not. And he paid a heavy price for that at the end of his life when he began really reflecting on that. I don't see Mr. Musk as a successful leader. He knows how to make a lot of money. But as a leader, Twitter is no longer the company that it used to be in terms of its functionality and why people use it. And people are now repelled and don't want to use it because of the kind of leader he is and the leadership style he embraces. And this notion of, I'm in charge so I can do what I want. And I can tell you that you have to literally work around the clock and sleep on the floor in order for me to consider you a legitimate employee. I mean, really? No,
Yeah.
no, no. It's just,
But you should feel a privilege to be able to work for such a genius. Anyway, I don't know anything about the inner workings of
I think his mind is, like a dangerous neighborhood you wouldn't want to be in after dark. I mean, he's scary. I mean, I really do. I follow your characterization of unhinged. And if you ignore those symptoms just because he knows how to make a lot of money, we'll pay a price for that. And we are paying a price for that.
Yeah. I've seen some very good interviews with him that actually, if you have a good empathetic interviewer where his defenses are not up, you can see that, he does have a vision for creating good things in the world. It's not that he's all bad. And, I think that's true for most people.
When he's willing to show up as a person and just talk to you about what he sees and how he came up with these ideas, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And that's where the genius is. Unfortunately, all the junk that gets wrapped around that, we lose that inner jewel, and that's a shame.
Yeah. So, you get called in when there's a trauma, when there's something like that. Wouldn't you love to be called in by a CEO saying, "We'd like to improve our culture, and I know you could help us"?
I do get called in for that. I do.
Yeah.
Sadly, those are always very panicked calls because people are marching out there's a stampede out the door. Then all of a sudden they realize there's a culture problem. And I do get brought in for that when there's deep symptomatology of a problem within the culture, which is just as traumatizing as other forms of trauma. Like I said, there's those 3 categories of trauma. And if people want to email me, I'll send you a list of the 3 categories and different kinds of trauma in the workplace underneath that, just so people can get a deeper understanding of what I'm talking about. And here's, I've had a lot of experience with leaders calling me and saying, "We need you to come in right now. We're having these problems." And so often they're looking for help. And so I congratulate them for that. What I have to find out, however, is if they are willing to even entertain the notion that they are part of the problem. It's not just all them. It's not just all the employees. They don't know how to work hard enough. They're lazy, their work ethic, all that. If they are willing to even entertain that their leadership style is one of the drivers, maybe not all, but one of the drivers of why this has become a toxic workplace and why people are leaving. Why are people talking to you with their feet? If they're willing to excavate and interrogate that, we have a really good chance of creating the kind of culture change they so desperately need. If there is a complete resistance to that, and in the beginning there's a resistance, but if that resistance stays, I will typically end the contract, because I'm not in the habit of wasting my time or my clients' money. And if they can only go so far, okay, that's where they are right now. I accept them for where they are and what they are. And I have a come to Jesus meeting with them and say, this is where we are. Now, these are the options I'm going to put in front of you. Pick your heart. Be willing to excavate this stuff or continue to have the outcomes you're having. It's up to you. I'm here to help you heal your organization. I'm not here to tell you how to run your organization. That's your job. All I can do is give you my recommendations and my suggestions and my assessments. And you choose to do with that information as you see fit. And sometimes people will take a deep breath and say, okay, let's keep going. Let's march forward.
Yeah.
And others, no, but we're going to go in a different direction, or our budget is run out on this, or whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I always leave the door open. If you change your mind, if something else happens, if you get a different perspective, you know how to reach me. But I will tell the truth. I will always tell the truth, because I have to live with myself, right? I have to look at myself in the mirror every day. And I just turned down a contract because I felt that the CEO was not coachable. I talked to the board and I said, I don't believe this person is coachable. I'm going to give you some suggestions on how to work with that problem before you work with the other problems. You do
Because
as
if the CEO doesn't shift, so a culture change in a company starts from the head up.
That's right.
Right. So what are some of the misconceptions people have about culture and culture change? I mean, I don't think a lot of people could, or many people couldn't tell you exactly what it is and why it's important. And it's kind of an abstract kind of thing. I mean, as an independent professional, working with independent professionals, culture is not something I swim in every day.
Right.
It's not I think of my attitude to work and stuff like that, but I'm not bossing people around. I don't have this, it's a whole different kind of game.
Right.
But it seems to me that in a company, it's about, well, we have this particular product or service. We wanted to do it well. We want to do a lot of it, and we want to make good money at it. What else is there? I mean, and yet they're missing the whole piece of culture that can make work a joyful place and have these companies make a real difference.
And that's the thing that I would love to hear a CEO say, yes, I make this product or service, but my real goal is to create and sustain a workplace that feeds people, both literally through food on the table for their family, but also in their soul and their spirit and their talent, that makes good use of their talent. This is a place they want to be. This is a place that they want to share their talent and their time. That this is a place that does not break people. In addition to the wonderful things we do in the world, start inside. You don't leave your internal stakeholders for last. Well, we have to be successful with our product first. And no, because those people won't stay. And so if they're not staying, you're constantly churning through people who have to build relationships and learn the role. And you're wasting social capital and you're wasting intellectual capital. So start inside first. And then you will have the wherewithal and the human engine to do all the fabulous things that you can and want to do out there. It's about whether we value culture and how do we measure that value? What does it mean to us? And values are not about what we do. I look at every company I go in, I say, okay, so show me your vision values page. Right.
If you have one.
And most often they're listing things that are not values. They're listing things that are standards of operation or, methods, right? Values are what inform your conduct in the world, and values remain impervious to external circumstances. They're your North Star, which is why during COVID, those companies that came through it okay is because they understood, even though I'm having to make decisions in chronic uncertainty, and I did a lot of teaching around how to make decisions and how to navigate chronic uncertainty. If you stay by your values, you'll know that the decisions you make today will resonate with what happens next week or next year because they are true to your values. They're not contingent on external factors that are constantly changing and in flux. And that's scary for a lot of people. They want to strictly remain externally focused. And you got to start internally. And when you're very clear on those values, decision-making becomes easier, and working with decisions to come, that decision-making process becomes easier because that value remains consistent. And when you're working with constant unintended, unwanted outcomes, the place I always start with organizations are, tell me the assumptions you were bringing to the table that created this. Tell me about the assumptions that went into making this decision, taking this, whatever. And then, are they accurate? Let's put those assumptions to reality testing. And it's amazing how often those assumptions were never accurate. But organizations will change around their flow chart and their organizational chart 57 times and still get the unwanted outcomes. They don't go to the core. And I've been saying for years, inaccurate assumptions are at the heart of every unwanted outcome. When you get your assumptions correct, it provides a very firm foundation to then say, okay, how are we going to make this change? Or how are we going to get into this new market? Or even should we get into this new market? And what are, it's a very firm, safe place with those values to go into the unknown. And isn't that what business always is? Always going into the unknown.
Sounds like Star Trek.
Well, in a way, yes.
To explore new worlds. So give me, if you can, the top half dozen really, really important values that a company, that's worthwhile for a company to embody, instill, promote, and operate from.
So for me, those values, because again, my definition and even in the research, values instruct our behavior.
Yes.
Okay? So what are the kinds of behaviors people want to work for and work with? What do they want to embody? How do they want to see themselves? People want to see themselves as honest, transparent, empathetic, compassionate. And those two words, I see a lot of people, roll their eyes like it's not appropriate in the workplace. And let me tell you something. It's because those things don't exist in the workplace where is why people leave, because you're dealing with human beings. And when you see someone and you engage with them from a place of empathy and from a place of compassion, and that doesn't mean you don't hold people accountable for not doing their job. That's not what that means. It means that you don't start screaming and yelling at them and making assumptions about them because you're not getting the outcomes you want. I guarantee you there's always more to that story than what you realize, which is why I'm a big fan of compassionate candor. And I teach this. And compassionate candor is about having those very difficult conversations about sticky things whilst maintaining the relationship, right? So we don't sacrifice the relationship to solve a problem. So empathy and compassion and honesty and transparency, these are things that inform our conduct. And and integrity. And what does integrity mean? Integrity comes into play when it's going to cost you something to do the right thing.
Yeah.
That's what people don't understand. They can say, well, I have integrity. Well, that gets determined when and if you do the right thing, when it's going to cost you something, potentially, when there's a sacrifice. That's when integrity comes forward. So
instead of cutting corners and not doing checks and
right.
I've seen so many TV series about that. Well, we did this and this happened, whatever.
Right. And so companies that in the past have not gone the route of laying people off when they're in difficult financial times, they look to other measures so that people can still keep their job and keep the company going. And I think it was the former CEO of the container company. I can't remember if that was Chip Connolly or another fellow, but they were in 2008, they were in very desperate straits. and they looked like they were going to go bankrupt. And the senior leadership team thought, well, we're going to have to start laying people off. And the CEO said, hang on, let's ask our people. They're the closest to our customers. They understand the market. They're dealing with it every day in a way that we are not. So there's a respect for information you don't have, right? And they went to their people and they said, this is what we need to do. We don't want to lay people off. Help us figure out how to do this without doing that. And he was amazed at what his people came forward with. And they came forward with some pretty hard things to do. And they implemented it. They didn't have to lay anybody off. And the company went on to have the best years financially they ever had. And his mindset was, I'd rather have a lot of people feel discomfort and distress than a few people feel it the most. So a distribution of that discomfort than a few people winding up absolutely destitute with nothing. And that's like fairness.
It's like how a country comes together during war. Look at the spirit of the people in Ukraine.
Right.
You know, they're willing to make sacrifices.
And it's a collective. It's not individualistic. It is a collective because they understand that they are fighting for each other, not just for themselves in their house. They are fighting for each other and the very soul of their culture, and they're not willing to let it go. And that's where that strength is, right? And it's a sense of fairness. We're all in this together. We're all suffering, but we're all going to benefit when we win. And fairness is something that comes up a lot in coaching when I'm coaching people from organizations, the feeling that there is no fairness here, or fair to some and not others. That's another very strong value that I think organizations would be wise to embrace, that, not just on a piece of paper, but in their behavior.
So are those explorations that you have with the company, let's look at your values, let's take them apart and put them back together again and see, you know, what do you want as values and how do we instill these over time into a company? Is that part of your work?
It can be. And what comes to mind is when I'm being brought into an organization that has been suffering with bullying and various forms of harassment. First of all, there is absolutely no research that demonstrates that sexual harassment prevention training actually prevents that kind of behavior.
Really?
But we do it because it's a check it off the box thing. Okay. So when I'm brought in, I first have to determine if the aggressor is still there or not. And even if the aggressor has left, the damage has been done and the legacy of that damage is there. And that damage has to be addressed and healed. The second part of that is we need to change the culture so that this behavior won't be tolerated. Literally creating a culture that is allergic to that behavior, because bullies get away with that nonsense because they have picked up on cues in the environment. It will be tolerated either because they have important relationships or they bring a lot of money in or whatever. So there's the healing piece of it. And then there's the really creating cultural change so that cannot take hold, that can't take root and thrive. And that's the part where you really start looking at values. All right. Well, you call this place your, family and everything. And I caution companies from using that word because they can really get caught up short when that word gets put in front of them and say, well, if your family were going through hard times, would you lay off your kids? So
you lay off your kids.
Yeah. It's looking at the values and saying, okay, how do we operationalize these values? Don't just talk about it, but how do we operationalize these values so that our people are safe?
Right.
There's psychological safety, and that this kind of traumatizing behavior can never again take hold here. And the first inkling that it does, it is addressed effectively, immediately. You cannot be here. If you do that, get out. You can't be here. I don't care how much money you bring in or anything else. That's a value. That's the
Yeah.
operationalization of a value, how you treat people and the expectations that are communicated to employees about behavioral expectations, not just productivity expectations.
Yeah. So it seems that's the big shift. I mean, the big shift of civilization is taking care of people.
As the neurobiologist Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about, the kind of behavior we've been talking about today, bullying and harassment and anger and passive aggressiveness and all of that, she calls it metabolically expensive. And what she means by that is when you behave that way to somebody, especially if there's a power imbalance, but when you behave that way towards someone, it causes their central nervous system to become dysregulated. They go into survival mode, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes metabolically expensive to be around somebody who creates that response in you all the time, right? It's why we have such huge anxiety issues in the workplace and mental well-being issues in the workplace. Because when you're in that environment, you live in a place of hypervigilance. When is it going to happen again? Right? And that does things to us physically and in our brain. She also talks about the fact that we are the caretaker of each other's central nervous system. So this gets back to what I was talking about earlier with relational skills and attunement, that when someone in a leadership position can be with somebody who's clearly upset, whether it's wearing an anger mask or a very emotional mask, that just in the relational skills, they can skillfully help that person's central nervous system come down. It's called co-regulation, right? And they're attuned to that person. And once that person's central nervous system comes down, then you can have a conversation with them, because then it's possible that they'll go from the limbic system to the executive portion of the brain, and we can have a conversation. Right? And you do not have to have an alphabet of letters after your name. You do not have to be a therapist. I'm not talking about you being a counselor or a therapist. Leaders of companies are there to drive their companies forward, not do therapy. These are relational skills. And these are the kinds of skills that have been missing in people with influence and power, their ability to be with somebody in that state, to help them come down and to be able to listen and respond skillfully to what they are hearing and experiencing. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. If only the venture capitalists could tune into that more, because so much of American business that's emphasized is, greed is good, making more money is better, the more the better, the one with the most toys when they die is the one that wins, all that kind of crap. And it's easy to get caught up in that no matter where you are in business. It's like, I was caught up in that for a while, and at a certain point I realized trying to be the number one person on Google all the time, and it's toxic,
and
no
that's
matter
where
what.
the inaccurate assumptions come in. I'll ask somebody, so is that really effective? Is that really working? And for how many people does that work for? And is that true? Is bigger always better? Is faster always better? Is that true? And we find so often that what we hail as success and all these wonderful things has not really been successful, has not been effective. It's just an image that's gotten a lot of play, gets a lot of notoriety.
Yeah.
It's an image. And it's kind of like a house of cards that I think is starting to fall, and people are starting to realize, oh, you know what? This really isn't true, or I can't sustain this, or this isn't sustainable, or I don't want to do this anymore. And that's the place so many people during COVID came to. I don't want to go back to that. Once they were able to be home for a while and their central nervous systems came down, the thought of going back to that. I just talked to somebody the other day who said, when I think about having to go into work, I feel like throwing up. And I said, well, what is it telling you?
And a smart company would figure, well, what do we have to, would it be useful for people to work together? And if it would be, how do we create a culture and environment so they love to be there? As opposed to, we just have to have people back.
And this is a question I ask when leaders bring me and say, we can't get our people to come back to the office. How do we do that? Tell us, how do we do that? And I say to them, you're asking the wrong question. Have you asked them why they don't want to be here? Why don't they want to be here? And they just kind of look at me like, well, why would we ask that question? And
it seems so frigging obvious, doesn't it?
And I'll say, do you think some people don't want to come back here because when they're at home, they're not at the receiving end of bullying? Oh, well, we don't have that problem here. And I'll say, how do you know? How do you know?
Yeah.
The fact that they don't want to come back here is messaging to you that there's information you don't have. And so it's best to start by asking those questions. And some of those things you may not be able to overcome, but you may be able to come up with really creative workarounds so that people want to still do the work and they want to contribute to your mission. They just don't want to have to become a sacrificial lamb. And I've said 1,000 times over the years in the coaching that I do, if your job is making you become a sacrificial lamb, no job should do that. And you need to sit up and ask yourself, what am I doing? Because their doors could close tomorrow. And then what do you have? You don't have the job, but your family life is in a shambles because you haven't been paying attention to them, because you've been putting every waking moment of your mind and your soul and your body into something that no longer exists. Was it worth it? This notion of, work-life balance, this makes me crazy when I hear this, work-life balance. First of all, try calling it life-work balance, because in our culture, what we talk about first is what we prioritize. So life-work balance. But why do we have to choose? This notion that when people walk through the door in the morning and they're supposed to leave their life behind and they're supposed to leave this is ridiculous. It's non-resonant with reality. So why are you asking people to override their biology? Let's stop doing that. So even your dog agrees. See that?
Yes, even my dog agrees.
Even your dog agrees. I bet your dog
my dog wants a treat. That's a different...
Aw.
Hey, baby, hold on a second.
I bet your dog has great life-work balance.
Yeah, he does. So, Lisa, this has really been a great conversation, really enlightening, really powerful, a lot of stuff to chew on for anyone who's in a company, leading a company, wanting their company to work better, is that we have to discover and live from more humanistic values, and that's ultimately going to make us happier and more successful.
And it will really get brought to the test when we have a major upheaval event or trauma event in the workplace. That's when it really becomes mission critical.
Right.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely to spend time with you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Great conversation.
Yeah.